Hi there, my name's Liv and I paint things. This week I wanted to try something a little bit different. I've been making a lot of sculpting videos, which are more so tutorial-esque, as sculpting for me is something I became interested in, researched, and learned how to do pretty recently. I think the first sculpture I made was in 2020. Painting, however, is something I've been doing since before high school, and I found it to be more difficult to describe what I'm doing in the same tutorial-y way as with sculpting. So today I bring you the PAINTCAST. I'm still going to do my best to describe what I'm doing, but a lot of it is just, I just do it and I make the paint do the things. But I feel like this gives me the opportunity to get more comfortable talking in front of a camera, or I guess a microphone. Also, for the love of all that is good in this world, don't mention my dirty fingers. I swear it's just paint, okay? And yes, I'm messy, and the top is covered in dirty fingerprints. Sue me.
I am never gonna financially recover from this.
Whenever I start any painting, I always do a very rough sketch of what I'm going to paint. Some people like to trace their reference photo, or they'll use a projector to cast the image onto the canvas. Normally, I just draw what I see. Especially with something like this subject, I don't feel it's very important to have a one-for-one image of my reference. It's not like painting a face, where the slightest change from the reference can seriously mess up your subject. I get as many details as I think are necessary, like where there are drastic color changes. In this case, the white fatty parts of the bacon are drawn very obviously, at least to me, separate from the more meaty parts. I generally follow a top-down approach when painting. This means I lay down the larger overall shapes and slowly work myself down to the finer details. I know for some artists they'll start on a specific area, say for example you're painting a portrait, one might start with an eye and then paint the entire eye in full detail before moving on to the next eye and then the mouth and so on. Whereas if I'm painting a portrait, I'll lay down the white of the eye, the darker shadows around the eyebrows, the skin tone, and then I'll go in and add the details on top of that base later. Generally, I follow a similar rule when painting on canvas as I do when painting figurines. Laying down the base color allows me to be pretty messy in where I place the colors. I try to stay inside the lines, but it really doesn't matter as I can always go over anything later with more paint. For this piece and almost all of the paintings I do, I use oil paint. I found I really evolved as an artist after I was introduced to oil paint in high school. I really love that it takes a half century for it to dry because I find it very forgiving. I know some artists will say they don't like oil painting because it's very easy to overwork the paint to the point where it becomes muddy, but I find even if that happens, you can always paint over it once it's dried. Also, when doing the base layer, I tend to thin out the paint a lot, as my later layers are pretty heavy. For those who aren't familiar with oil paint, basically the paint itself is very thick, almost like wall spackle, the stuff you use to fill holes and gaps on drywall. You can of course paint with just oil paint straight out of the tube if you want a lot of texture, or you like to paint with palette knives. Alternatively, you can add oil. For me, I use linseed oil, which I believe is the most commonly used by artists. This acts very similarly to acrylic mediums. The more oil you add to paint, the more runny, smooth, and thin the paint becomes. Some artists might use this to create wash effects, where you can layer a very oily layer of paint over top, say a window, to add a glassy sheen to it. Once dried, oil paint with lots of oil added to it tends to be very shiny and reflective, whereas paint with less oil added will dry more matte. This is of course if you don't varnish your paintings, which is something I just never do. Why don't I varnish my paintings, you ask? Because I'm lazy. I often find, when watching other artists on YouTube, I feel like I have a very unorthodox way of painting when it comes to color. A lot of artists will have this massive palette where they'll mix every color they're going to use in their painting on the palette, and then they'll lay down the colors on the canvas in a sort of checkered patchwork way, and then they'll blend the edges of each patch together. I tend to mix my colors directly on the canvas. So for this painting, on my palette I had vermilion and cadmium red. Those were the only reds I had straight out of the tube. I also had titanium white, a pink color that Winsor & Newton call flesh tint, raw sienna, burnt umber, and magenta. For the fatty parts of the bacon, I laid down white and then added the flesh tint and magenta directly onto the canvas and mixed them there. You can see me doing this a couple times on the light pink parts of the bacon where the flesh tint wasn't as light as I needed it to be, so I added white directly on and mixed them with a couple swirly swirls, and then spread the color as far as I felt it needed to go. A lot of this painting process is difficult for me to describe because I just look at the reference photo and I go, the fatty parts of the bacon is a little purpley, so I'll add some purple. Another thing I really like about oil paint compared to acrylic is the fact that I can almost sculpt the paint in a way. Take for example all the little white lines of fat that run into the red meaty parts of the bacon. I'll paint the lines in white and then I can go back and literally scrape the extra white off with my paintbrush. I'm not painting over the whites here, I'm literally scraping the paint off the canvas. I love this because I have pretty shaky hands and they usually become more shaky the more I focus on doing something very small and detailed. So being able to remove the paint like this means I can get a very, very thin line that will be much more difficult for me to achieve with, say, acrylic paint. I have a pretty bad habit of loading my brush with paint to the point where it's just a giant blob on the end. Please don't judge me. I think one of my favorite things about painting is I find it much more freeform than making figurines. With sculpting, I find there are more defined rules, like I always have to start with a tinfoil skeleton. The figurine itself needs to be one piece. You can't defy gravity and have something just floating in the air. The clay needs to be a certain thickness in order for it to be structurally solid. You have to bake it at a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. I'm sure there are traditionally trained artists who would argue,
"You can't mix the colors on the canvas. You can't use baby oil to clean your brushes."
By the way, if any oil painters out there hate turpentine for cleaning brushes, use baby oil and dish soap. It works so well and it isn't literal poison. I was never formally trained in painting. I learned a lot about the fundamentals in art class in high school. I was very lucky to have an amazing teacher who spent a lot of time working with me and guiding me as I explored painting. So I'm familiar with the basics of art like line, value, and depth, but more professional, I guess, methods are not something I'm well versed in. I become painfully aware of this when I try to paint anything with landscapes. Oh god, landscapes are so hard. Figures? Fine. Animals or objects? Great. But landscapes?
No!
After high school, I went to York University for Fine Arts, specifically for painting. And I very quickly realized that that was not the place for me. My art history classes were pretty interesting, however my studio classes were an absolute joke. I understand wanting to get people to try new things and to push them out of their comfort zone, but there were some projects I made where I was just left wondering, what the hell are you trying to teach me? I remember one of my paintings was I had to take a wooden board and place strips of painter's tape in geometric shapes and then paint those shapes with gouache paint. Did they tell me how to use gouache beforehand? Nope. So I went into it thinking, oh, gouache is acrylic paint that dries matte instead of shiny. I had no idea that gouache is more like watercolor than acrylic. You're supposed to add water to make it smooth and easier to work with. You can of course paint with just gouache, but in my case, my painting was covered with these tiny raised bumps because the gouache was so thick. Gouache is often used by illustrators because it makes a very smooth, flat, lineless image when it's used correctly. I learned all of this on my own 4 years after leaving York. The only genuinely helpful thing I learned there was how to stretch my own canvases, but even then, I later learned that traditional canvas stretching involves the use of a base coat of glue, which is oftentimes rabbit skin glue, before laying down the white gesso layer. I was told to go straight to gesso. Realistically, it doesn't make a difference. I don't gluify my canvases before painting, but still, you'd think this would be something your $7,000 a year professor would mention. I was only in York for a year, and in that time, I became very resentful about art because I felt like my professors were pretty hard-headed and would never admit when a student had a good idea or a style that was pretty unique. I felt like they just wanted every student to make the same artwork that was in line with the professor's idea for the project. I have a couple friends who went to OCAD, which is an art and design university in Toronto. One of them left in their 4th year because they felt a genuine dislike for creating art. The school that was supposed to teach them, help them grow, and fall in love with their craft made them despise it. I genuinely feel if I didn't leave the school when I did, I would have stopped doing art completely. Of course, when I changed into the program I graduated in, linguistics, which I absolutely love, I had less time to work on my art. As any college or university student can agree, it's extremely time-consuming. I graduated in the spring of 2021, and since then I've made so many paintings. In July and August, I was averaging about 1 painting or sculpture a week. Now with YouTube, I'm forcing myself to have a schedule, and I've been maintaining that same number of 1 painting or sculpture a week. Now, I'm not saying this to convince anyone to not go to art school. However, I am trying to convince you to not go to York because it sucks. If you love art and want a career in art, for sure do it. I hope your experience is better than mine, genuinely. I wouldn't wish my 9 months of on anyone. For me, it was not the vibe.
It's not the vibe. Stop!
You've likely noticed I use literally only one brush for this entire painting, besides laying down the base color, because doing that with a 2mm brush would be agony. I use only one brush. I don't know why I do this. Sometimes I'll switch to larger brushes, especially if I'm trying to blend large areas together. I really like working with such a small brush for canvases this size. I just find it to be easier. I don't know. Some artists like to start with the background before moving to the figure, but for me, I often use my pinky finger as an anchor point, hence the dirty fingerprints along the top of the canvas. Because of this, if I was to start with the background, it would definitely become a smooshy blob of bad. For the background of this bacony painting, I laid down this horrific highlighter yellow, and I added some raw sienna and burnt umber to it, along with some white along the edges. Behind the yellow container thing, I tried my hand at using a palette knife. It's something I've never worked with before, and thinking back, I wish I used a color other than white. Like if I made the background the darker pink and then used the light pink with the palette knife. But I don't really care enough to go back and change it, to be honest. Call me lazy, I frickin' dare you. By the way, this footage is sped up by 500%. I didn't keep track, but I'd estimate it took around 10 hours to make this painting. I had to paint the text on the label on a different day. Initially, whenever I was painting the letters on, my hand was shaking so badly that I just had to stop. It was awful. Definitely, painting words onto wet paint is pretty hard, but the handshake made it so much worse. With the last bit of paint smoothed out, we can get to the lovely, lovely reveal. Thanks for listening to my rambles today. I hope you learned a bit about me and a bit about art in general. Seriously, if you have the means to, I know they're a bit pricey, but pick up some oil paints and try them out. They're very fun to work with and they help me a lot on my painting journey. If you want to see more of the things I make, hit the subscribe button. And if you liked it, then hit the like button. Okay, bye!
Thank you!